Today I will talk about um, reviewing the evidence of open science impact. So there's lots and lots of metrics and currently for monitoring the uptake of open science, but what actual real world effects is it having the real world effects that we've supposed it would have as we try to introduce it? So I just want to say first that this is a work from a project, EC-funded project Pathos, with many, many other contributors who aren't here, but just to highlight them. The study objectives then were to establish what evidence exists in the literature about the academic, societal, and economic impacts of open science. We wanted to synthesize this knowledge, as well as any enabling or inhibitive factors, any negative impacts, whether there were trade-offs amongst types of impact, and make notes on quality assessment of this literature. You'll see from the search keywords on the side, we covered a broad range of types of impact and also many different elements, or all the different elements of open science. So we used the PRISMA methodology for scoping reviews, which involved identifying the relevant studies. We looked in Scopus and Web of Science generalist databases, and then did intensive snowball searching of reference lists to identify other studies using OpenAlex. We then screened through all these, many thousands of entries, extracted data, and then reported it. The protocol was pre-registered on the Open Science Framework, and preliminary results of the database search are already available via Zenodo on this link. And I'll say, I haven't yet, but I will add these to the OSF for the repository of presentations for the conference. So looking in then, what did we find on academic impact? We found 311 studies from the database search. It will be over 400 after the Snowball and Gray literature search, but we're still in the final phase of data analysis for those extra studies. What did we find? So the main portion of the evidence on academic impact, over 100 studies, I think, were about the citation advantage of open access. And this was a very, very large literature, but lots of those studies have only partly convincing evidence, lots of confounding variables. And so but the main overall finding, I guess, is that there is a citation advantage to open access, which I guess makes sense. It's a lot more visible, a lot more findable, especially for people outside who don't have access to subscriptions and so on. Then there is some growing evidence that the open access model that uses APCs, article processing charges, is fostering inequalities in regard to who publishes where. Open and fair data are associated with data reuse and as citation advantage for the associated papers. There's a positive effect of open data on computational reproducibility. Open code and software produce efficiency gains in software development and may also increase citations of associated papers. There's evidence that citizen science is increasing the efficiency and scope of data collection, and open peer review shows neutral to positive effects on review quality. The main challenge in this is that the studies, there's often insufficient evidence to establish strongly causal claims, in particular, as I said, for the citation advantage of open access and open data. And this study, as I said, we're late stage data analysis, midway in and partway through writing up. This paper will be available soon. For societal impact, what did we find? There were 196 studies that we identified. The heavy majority of those were about citizen science, though. Some from open access, limited evidence of other open science aspects. Evidence shows impact in terms of education and awareness, Obviously, with citizen science, this is a major aim of citizen science. Uh, Impact on climate and environment there, lots and lots of citizen science projects in this area, and on citizen engagement. Some are related to policy and governance, equity empowerment, and so on. The main challenges and gaps here is, again, limited evidence of limited causal evidence. We didn't find any evidence of impact from open and fair data upon society, of the impact upon society, which really um, uh, uh, we found very surprising. Lots of the evidence that claims to be about societal impact of open access is really referring to altmetrics, and there's really a question of what altmetrics are measuring. They're often taken within the literature, at least, to be evidence of societal impact, but who is actually retweeting or who is blogging about these things? Are they from inside or outside the academy, for example? And then it's difficult to measure and study societal impacts in the medium and long term just because of the complexity of those impacts. This paper has been pre-printed. It's currently under journal review. And as I say, we'll make the slides available, so all the links will be available there. And then finally, on economic impact. After a lot of searching, I think following the database searching, we had very few papers, about 10 or so. But after snowballing and especially grey literature search, we found 70 studies. And the main findings are that there is evidence of cost savings through faster access to knowledge and avoiding duplication of efforts as a direct economic impacts. But there's little empirical evidence of positive benefits of open access and open fair data on industry. However, little empirical evidence of positive benefits. The biomedical and biotech sectors show the greatest levels of evidence of benefits, but this might be just because they're the ones looking into this most. And evidence stems largely from case studies. There's a lack of models for broad economic assessments. And so challenges here, there's a lack of robust evidence except in key areas. There's really a cluster of evidence about societal impact of citizen science, about open access citation advantage, much less in other areas, which makes us think that there's maybe something of a streetlight effect going on, that we're measuring what's easy to measure because there's ready-made data sets or methodologies for doing so. But also that we've been focused too much on monitoring the uptake of open science rather than its actual impacts. And so we would call for a lot more research in this direction. There's a lot of issues of causality, correlation, lack of standards for defining and measuring impact. And so we have already, as I said, the report of the database searches. This is already available via Zenodo. We have the preprint of the results of societal impact available and online. The write-up of the academic and economic impacts are underway. And we've made all of this literature available via a Zotero library, which is available from our project website. And so with that, thank you.
Awesome, Tony. Thank you. That was right on time. Perfect timing.
Thank you.
Really interesting study. Thank you for sharing that with us. Up next, we have Lisa Williams.
That's me. All right. Good morning from Sydney, Australia. Welcome to everybody who's joining a bit later in the evening. I am highly caffeinated, and so I will try not to speak at the speed of sound here. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about some work that we've done in the Australia's Women in STEM Ambassador team. And before talking about the work at all, I'd like to highlight that this work is led by our senior research associate, Dr. Isabel Kingsley, a fantastic team of research assistants, Nicholas Ho and Amanda Chan. and the Women in STEM ambassador herself, another Lisa Harvey-Smith. So with this team, we led a trial of anonymous peer review of access to scientific funding equipment. So to set the scene a little bit, many of you would be familiar with some famous kind of case studies purporting the value of anonymization. So famously argued that gender bias in selection for orchestras was eliminated once auditions went anonymous so that the evaluators could not see who was playing the music. This idea has certainly gained a lot of traction in hiring, but here at this conference, we're really interested in science. And of course, anonymization in the peer review process is really held to be fundamental to a lot of kind of the value of publication and resource allocation. What our take on this is that anonymization, kind of building on those findings out of orchestra auditions and so on, is whether anonymization itself can help level the playing field from people from different backgrounds. And there is some evidence of this. So for instance, peer review in the publication process when anonymous has been argued to eliminate reviewer bias on the basis of gender. Trials within the NIH in the US have shown some evidence that anonymization can eliminate biases against underrepresented groups from various racial backgrounds. And famously, NASA trialing anonymous review for access to the Hubble Space Telescope has been argued to eliminate gender bias. So we have a range of evidence here suggesting that anonymization can have value. But at least within the scientific resource access question, when we started this trial, the evidence was really limited to that Hubble Space Telescope example. So we set off to establish whether those similar effects would hold when we looked at organizations within Australia, and specifically with the idea of looking at a range of organizations, understanding that each organization is going to have nuances in its process of evaluation to see if anonymization within their context might have any effect. So we recruited 4 organizations, including 2 telescope time allocation processes, but also the Australian Centre for Neutron Scattering, and the National Computational Merit Allocation Scheme, which grants access to one of the major computational infrastructures in Australia. So these organizations joined on board with the project and agreed to anonymize their application process. 3 of these organizations did what you might think would be classic anonymization, requiring applicants to exclude names and affiliations in the text of the application, to use third-person language, provide team expertise and background in a separate document that was available, but not used during the evaluation of the application itself. A 4th organization engaged in what we're calling semi-anonymization, using first initials and surnames, removing affiliations, and shifting the applicant list to the end of the application, arranging it so you couldn't tell who the lead investigator was, but identification information was still available within the application. So with the data that we were granted from the organizations, which included several rounds prior to anonymization and after anonymization, we wanted to observe the degree in the existence of disparities prior to anonymization. So kind of scene setting what's going on at these 4 places before they implemented anonymization. And second, what the effect of anonymization was in terms of gender and career seniority of the lead researcher. We examined these 2 questions across 3 different outcomes. We had access to the scores that the assessing panel gave each application. We had success rates and resource allocation, which was the fraction of the requested time or resource that the successful outcomes got relative to what they asked for. So we had access to just over 4,500 applications. The different organizations vary in size here. And we had about 3/4 of our data from prior to anonymization and about 1/4 from after. Just briefly on our analysis approach, we used a regression modeling framework, general linear models, to assess our 2 questions in 2 stages. So looking first at the data prior to anonymization and then after. At that stage 1, where we were asking questions about existing disparities, we included gender of the lead investigator and career level or seniority for 2 of the 4 organizations that gave us that data. The other 2 did not record that. At stage 2, we added the treatment variable, which was anonymization pre-post, and the 2-way interactions between treatment and gender and treatment and career seniority. Due to variability in the organizations, we decided to model the data from each organization separately. We did do a meta-analysis across the 4 organizations, but I'm not going to be talking about that data today. So to hop into what we found, in terms of career seniority, what we found, again, in the 2 of the 4 organizations that gave us this data, we saw no significant differences in career seniority in terms of the 3 outcomes prior to anonymization. So here we don't see evidence of disparities in access. After anonymization, however, we saw that at one of the 2 organizations, anonymization boosted success rates for early career researchers. And here's what the data look like. So prior to anonymization, you can see a fairly level playing field according to career seniority. But once those applications were anonymized, you see this kind of very drastic jump in success rates amongst early career researchers. This might point to evidence of quality of application. So maybe the equitable playing field before was actually masking the fact that there were disparities in kind of the quality or worthiness of applications prior to, but I'd be hesitant to kind of overinterpret that. And I will also take with a grain of salt that we only saw this at one of the 2 organizations. In terms of gender, we saw no, again, mirroring career seniority, no pre-existing disparities in any of the 3 outcomes according to investigator gender. Here's what the data look like. There are variabilities across organizations, but you can see here the data in blue and the data in gray showing equivalence in outcomes across the three different measures we have. The existing gender equity in scores and allocated resources, which I'll show here, was not impacted by anonymization. So kind of we have no impact of the trial as a systematic effect, according to lead investigator gender, except for success rates. And again, at one of the 4 organizations. So at one of the 4 organizations, we saw increased success rates for women lead researchers relative to men, again, pointing to perhaps that the existing apparent equity in the system may have been rectified once identifying information was revealed. So a few conclusions I'd like to offer. One is that anonymization can serve as a mechanism to improve peer review, particularly for early career researchers and women lead researchers, especially when implemented with care where and when needed. So kind of the big flagship finding out of this is that we actually didn't have existing disparities in the data. But when we remove identifying information, disparities, if you call it that, or advantages emerge would suggest we need to be really careful about interpreting this type of data. We do need to be data-driven, especially in a context in which anonymization is held as kind of the key to access and transparency and peer review. And I'll offer 2 or perhaps 3 implications here. We really need to have evaluations such as this to establish when anonymization will and won't work. This is a commonly held answer when funding bodies or publications uncover inequities in access. But I think that we need to be careful and do the research first before rolling it out widely. I'll take a big caveat here. The only data we had access to used a binary gender approach, so we can't speak to non-binary identities. And we only had career seniority, so we didn't have access to ethnicity. And there are really important questions around that with access to scientific resources, funding, and publication. And I'll finally say maybe a broader call is that access to scientific resources and publication and other areas where anonymization might pop up are part of a broader ecosystem where there may or may not be equity in the scientific process. And so we need to kind of look at the bigger systematic barriers that might be arising. I'd invite you all to access the preprint of this. We also have a slightly more publicly accessible version of the research written up as a research brief. And there are a whole slew of ways to contact me. And that is my time. So I will wrap up there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. And then we will roll right into Kathy and Jason. Kathy, you might be muted.
And I think there's the presenter view is up. I was just going to say, Lisa, I just got off a flight from Sydney to the US. So I'm on your time, but it's light out. It's just weird.
I'm so sorry.
All right, I think we're together now. Can you see my slide?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Fantastic. Great. So thank you so much for organizing and for inviting us to present. We're going to co-present this project. Jason and I are meta researchers and we're housed in law schools. And we, along with the kind of a too small handful of others, are working to document how open, transparent, and replicable empirical legal scholarship is. And recently, we've been exploring how we might import basic principles of open science into scientific misconduct investigations to make them more useful for the scientific community. So Jason is going to start by just motivating our focus on this research question. Let's see.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. So my part's a little bit briefer, I think. Kind of just establishing maybe what the stakes might be when there's lots of widespread reporting and actual research fraud. So one thing that is talked about a lot when this occurs is threats to the public trust in science. And this is a pretty widespread area of research, kind of not specific to fraud a lot of the times, just there are a lot of large surveys out there about how much the public trusts science. And usually it's pretty high. So science is treated as more trustworthy than other institutions like politicians and like religious leaders. But just this year, there was this Pew survey we have up there, which is that for the first time, it seems to be decreasing a little bit, although trust is still pretty high, but maybe slightly lower than it used to be. And go to the next slide. And I think one thing that's relevant to investigations of research misconduct and trust is the relationship between the transparency of science and the public's trust in it. And I don't think this was in the most recent Pew survey, but in the one done about 5 years ago, they did find that there was a relationship such that the public said they trusted science more when it was conducted openly. There was open access to data, and that there were independent reviews of it, which are two things that I think are especially relevant to some recent cases of fraud and investigations of them. I think it's also important because trust is associated with, or it's central to many normative accounts of good science, like Merton and other philosophers and sociologists of science. And just kind of paraphrasing also a colleague of ours, Samine Bazier, who is very active in open science type stuff. She often says that you don't really want the public to uncritically trust science. So there just shouldn't be universal trust for science. That's probably not a good idea. But because transparency allows, in theory, for others to detect errors and understand what's happening, that seems to be a feature that if the public is using that as one of their indicium of credibility, and that's probably a pretty useful one. So The next slide then is going to dive like further into that relationship. I sometimes read a lot of social scientists use this concept of epistemic trust, which is generally is the scientist a reliable source of knowledge? And it's generally considered to have three components. One is expertise, like are they like knowledgeable and competent? But then there are two that are kind of unrelated to like knowledge itself. There's benevolence, which is that the person's perceived as having society's best interest in mind, and then there's integrity, that they follow some principles and prescriptive rules. And so, just sorry, same slide, Kathy. So I'm just, I mean, maybe you're encouraging me to move a little faster, which I'll do. So Jin Song has a great paper there, which he finds that when people are instructed about what open science is and they're shown an open science, a paper that uses open science principles, they trust it more, they ascribe higher expertise, benevolence, and integrity. And I think that leads to one of our key points, which is that when it comes to investigations of research fraud, transparency is probably something that's going to promote the trustworthiness of science, even if it shows that some science was conducted badly. So I'll go forward now and I'll be a little faster. It's hard to know how much fraud is out there. There's been several surveys of questionable research practices, and they usually include one question that's kind of pretty close to fraud or falsification. And it's usually lower. People self-report less of that. There's one outlier, which I don't fully understand. I think it's business school people. But there's also a lot of anecdotal examples that we know about. Francesca Gino, Dan Ariely, and Diedrich Stapel are the three that we've kind of noted there, which I'll talk about in the next slide, which is my last slide. So I'll just very quickly say, because you probably already know this, that there's a lot of variation in how institutions report their investigations, right? So Diedrich Staples was made public. Gino's was only made public after a court order, and her lawyer resisted that. And with Ariely's investigation at Duke, we really only know things that he's telling us, which is odd. So I'll turn to Kathy now. Sorry, I went a bit long.
Great. So the next thing we explored was what's currently required of universities. And U.S. regulations set out general requirements for how research misconduct investigations should be conducted when misconduct allegations involve federal agency-supported research. So, for example, research supported by the NIH, National Institutes of Health, or National Science Foundation. And so lots of regulations exist, but they're quite general. So, for example, regulations delegate expressly misconduct investigations to awardee institutions, including universities. And they require universities and other institutions to initiate inquiries and conduct the investigations. They do require some protection of whistleblowers and the accused. And universities are required to take necessary actions to ensure research integrity, although not much is said about specifics around what they actually should do. They also are required to take action in response to a finding of research misconduct, but again, not a lot of specifics. In a lot of cases, regulations require the shrouding of information. So investigative and adjudicative research misconduct records maintained by the agency, regulators themselves, are expressly exempted from public disclosure. And the Department of Health and Human Services requires institutions to protect the confidentiality of the accused and other people involved in the investigation. And so we're really exploring this from a normative perspective. The Department of Health and Human Services Office of Research Integrity has proposed making investigations a bit more robust and transparent, and it's really sparked a heated debate. And the main values being weighted against one another are the benefits on one side of maximal time, real-time correction of the scientific record as fraud is detected and brought to light. The main cost seems to be damage to the accused reputation and the accused co-authors and the accused institution and so on, where the institutions are competing against one another for federal research dollars. And so our contribution to the debate is to explore as lawyers, what can we learn from existing procedural models used in systems that involve similar stakes? And so we think of very basic principles around procedural aspects of both civil and criminal trials. The default in our system, criminal justice system, is that all submitted evidence and other materials related to trials are made available to the public. And there are exceptions, but they're quite limited, and they don't involve generally reputation protection. And the only exception there, one of the only exceptions, is in the case of minors or particular, sensitive family issues. And so we make a push to argue that university investigations should adopt transparency policies that are similar to how we conduct civil and criminal trials. And we want to go beyond transparency with our recommendations. And one thing that we think is quite important, but hasn't been discussed as much in this recent debate about transparency, is who conducts the investigation. So we think that mandates should go beyond transparency. So, for example, regulators should require disclosure of conflicts of interest of inquiry and investigation committee members. So there's one example where Stanford, University, when it was investigating its own president for scientific misconduct, put on the committee, the investigation committee, an investor in the president's own company. And so this was uncovered by a journalist, and this person stepped down from the committee. And Stanford actually decided to hire an external investigator. And we think actually that's quite a good idea from the beginning. So alternatively, we recommend that regulators should require that investigation committees be comprised solely of external members chosen by regulators. So we think a conflict of interest can exist when the universities are in the business of selecting those investigators. And then finally, what protections do the accused deserve? And here we think, the accused should have quite robust protection, not in the form of transparency, but in the form of confidentiality, but in the form of process. So full information disclosure in real time to allow for a robust defense, the ability to respond to all accusations in light of all the evidence, and the right to introduce evidence for exculpatory purposes. So we'd love to have your comments on this. You can find our emails addresses on the internet in our institution. So thank you so much.
All right, thanks. And we'll roll right into Nathan.
Share my screen. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Nathan Morrow from Tulane University in New Orleans. I'll be sharing some work we've been doing over the last couple of years with Dr. Beverly Wright of the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and Dr. David Patchett of Tennessee State University, looking at how open science can advance environmental justice on the Gulf Coast of the United States. And so I wasn't sure exactly who we were going to have here. So it's a very NASA-focused type of talk, which is interesting because NASA was the first to declare a year of open science, I think. And so we actually started in 22 with Louisiana Space Fund selecting us to do some mapping of what was going on in the state in terms of open science, environmental justice research, and environmental justice organizations and networks, looking at whether they overlapped, what the interactions were, what the issues were with access to data. Especially data is the big issue with environmental justice, one of the big constraints. And we found that there wasn't a lot going on with open science actually across the South. It's one of the areas with the greatest disparities and contributions, say, to GitHub, other open science practices that we had documented. And that led to being selected as part of the first cohort of environmental justice and equity projects for NASA's new program. It's called the A49 program element. And we had the shortest kind of projects. It was only 9 months to look at the priorities for environmental justice communities in terms of the types of Earth data or science that they could get from NASA. But we also built in from the beginning how the TOPS initiative, the Transform to Open Science. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. It's a 10-year program at NASA to capacity development, infrastructure, culture change around fully embracing open science for the NASA program, and how that could engage. And we put together a landscape analysis for them that was we found very well accepted, and it contributes actually to our current project where we're working directly with communities on open science training, improvement in research and open science data management protocols, and open science research plans. So these are some of the recommendations. We had 8 recommendations coming out of our landscape analysis. And the interesting thing is 4 of them actually touched on open science. It seems to really work well with disciplines like environmental justice that have had historically such big issues with data access and data transparency. It's just a natural match. So yeah, promote open science for UJ community engagement as a basis for training initiatives and network development. And that was the project that we're working on now. And then in the work that we do, I don't know how many people are engaged in community-led, academic-supported type of research, but often there are these what we call backbone organizations, so a little bit larger organizations. The Deep South Center for Environmental Justice actually is the oldest environmental justice organization in the country, founded by Dr. Wright in New Orleans. And with that history, it's the place where the networks meet. It's where there's some historical knowledge of the different projects that have gone on. There's a QR code there that will take you to the full report. If you're interested, it actually does a really nice summary of the civil rights movement and how that contributed to the origins of environmental justice, and a little bit of informing. We've got a lot of environmental scientists who are now interested in engaging in environmental justice, but they might not know the history, the discipline, and that actually goes into our next recommendation. Is that really in environmental justice, we speak for ourselves as one of the foundational principles. We get into the foundational principles of environmental justice as well, which is a little bit different than other types of science, but also seems to match really well with open science and citizen science type approaches. And so looking at how multidisciplinary teams that include social health and social researchers along with the earth science was important, and that it actually needed to be developed around environmental justice theory and practice rather than traditional earth system science. And we see this as a complete transformation, again, that fits very well with open access publishing. Is one of the reasons why environmental justice theory is not so well known. It's very much a book culture. It's gray literature. And then the few journals that do publish environmental justice papers are behind paywalls. So it's worse than the 90%. There's almost no free environmental justice peer-reviewed literature out there. Then it really is important. And once again, that's a funding issue for paying those processing fees. And then a really interesting idea coming out of Deep South Center's work over decades and decades with taking action on the research, but then also strengthening the community by engaging the community itself in, for instance, a toxic cleanup or water quality management, and training community members to actually be the ones who get the contracts to do the environmental cleanup. We thought that actually could apply to open science. One of the big issues in environmental justice is that community partners need to be equitable partners in research. And the more training that especially youth could have in open science to manage repositories, do code, actually collect data and measurements in the community, and with all of the sort of sensors we use, air quality, temperature, water quality, measurement we do in environmental justice research, it's a natural place where we could train a whole generation, and that's our idea across the South, a network of trained open science experts that could engage with researchers. Most of the researchers actually, PIs come from the North, come to the South, don't bring their students, fly in, fly out. We would actually like to have the communities and institutions in the South be more integrated into the research that is going on. And so that leads us to our current project, where we are taking 5 cohorts, where we pair a Southern academic with a Southern environmental justice community leader, usually from a community organization, and then a mixed group for a cohort of about 5 people that we're training in the NASA TOPS Open Science 101 curriculum. And so, and then we were going to work together on a research plan, fully developing an open science data management plan. And so we've had some really interesting, we're sort of 2.5 years into this. We've had NASA officers come down, and we've done field trips out to Stennis and Mississippi with community members, having NASA open science interested staff spending time in communities, looking at the types of measurements they're doing, looking at how NASA data could be used, and where open science approaches and tools could be better integrated into the workflows. And we just, as of last week, our first cohort was Dr. Paget from Tennessee State. We have Dr. Singleton from Dillard University, Roylene from Sankofa Water Park in the lower ninth ward of New Orleans, which is interesting green infrastructure. Come to New Orleans, we'll show you around some really interesting environmental justice projects. And some other groups there getting their first badges. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the TOPS Open Science certification, but we plan to have 5 cohorts of 5 and up to 50 trained, certified open science partners to work on environmental justice issues across the South, from Houston to Pensacola, by sort of late summer, by August. So it's a fun, interesting project, applying open science to advance environmental justice.
Awesome. Thanks, Nathan. Really cool.
Thanks.
And we have our last but not least, we've got Alicia and Shauna. Take it away.
Thank you, Crystal. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Shauna Taylor, Project Manager of Open Science at the Association of Research Libraries, or ARL, and I am joined today by Alicia Hopleck-Moore, Research Support Associate at the University of Minnesota. So today we are highlighting results from a recent report published by ARL called Making Research Data Publicly Accessible, Estimates of Institutional and Research Expenses, or Researcher Expenses. So a link to that report, as well as a few other resources, are referenced at the end of these slides, and our slides are already in OSF. So to examine the costs of making research data publicly available in the US, ARL was granted an award by the National Science Foundation in 2021. So it was from this award that the Realities of Academic Data Sharing project at ARL came about. And in the first phase of this project, we had 6 institutions participate in the study. So they're listed here, but I'd like to shout them out. So University of Minnesota, Duke University, the University of Michigan, Cornell University, Virginia Tech, and Washington University in St. Louis. So I will add that Alicia and I are just 2 members of our 9-person research team, which represents ARL, these 6 institutions, and the Data Curation Network in the United States. So how do we go about gathering data on the costs of research data sharing? We knew that costs were not just restricted to direct researcher costs, like that they would put in their grants. So in addition to including researchers in our study, we also included institutional administrators of units or departments that support data sharing activities and who had knowledge of unit expenditures and salaries. So our aim was to find the true cost of data sharing if we could, and we thought that including both of these participant groups was the best way to get us there. So I'll mention that we narrowed the scope of researchers to include only those funded by the Department of Energy, the National Institutes of Health, and the National Science Foundation. And due to time restrictions today, we won't dig into funder analysis, but please see our report again at the end of our slides. If you are interested in the funder breakdown specifically, we had enough data to do analysis with NIH data and NSF data. Both participant groups were sent similar surveys, and for administrators, we asked them to identify the data sharing activities they support at the institutional level. And for researchers, we asked which activities they performed throughout the life cycle of their project, as well as whether they sought institutional or external support for those activities. We held follow-up interviews with both groups to refine and clarify some of the expense question responses. It could be kind of tricky, so we just wanted to make sure that we were asking the right questions. And these interviews were in fact fruitful, as they gave us insight into which questions we should refine for phase 2 of our project, and also gave us insight into how researchers in particular are thinking about their data sharing expenses. So in the expense data analysis, you will see that there are 27, and this Alicia will touch on this, there are 27 data management and sharing activities, and we categorize these into 5 phases. We felt it necessary to group the activities this way to best contextualize them for the researchers and for the administrators. These data sharing phases roughly correspond to the research and grants lifecycle phases that some of you may be familiar with.
Okay, so I'm going to dive into the results. And so here we have, you can see all 27 activities. They're kind of a shorthand. But as you know, and those of you who have been sharing data, it's more than just like putting the data in a place. There's a lot that goes into managing and sharing data. So we first want to look at the support for each of these activities within institutions. So how are institutions supporting them? Are they supporting all these different pieces that go into data management and sharing? So for each institution, we calculated the percent of units or offices that supported the activities and then took the averages across the institutions. That's what's presented in these bars. Again, the individual bars are the individual activities, and then they're color-coded by the phases Shauna mentioned on the previous slide. So we found that institutions provided support for all of these data management activities. All the bars are above 0. And the largest proportions of offices were in support for planning and project startup activities, so such as reviewing or assisting with data management plans. And so that had an average of 48% of the offices helped with that. In data collection, storing, and management, such as active data management, and data retention and preservation activities, such as migration of files to a new format or file systems, and ensuring security is adequate. Interestingly, when we asked researchers how they do these activities, we found that they were not engaging with support offered by their institutions. So this slide has back-to-back graphs for each activity. So on the left are the percent of researchers who completed the activities with institutional assistance, so making use or going to or getting help from one of the offices at their university. And on the right are those who completed the average percent who completed those activities on their own or in their lab. And so there is a notable difference between these bars. Many more researchers are completing these activities in their own labs and not with institution support. And so this is notable even because there's not a pattern. So even the kinds of activities where institutions are really supporting them, researchers are still doing them on their own, such as preparing data management plans. So our second piece of this, and most important piece of this, so what's the cost? So what are the costs associated with offering these activities and supporting these activities from an institutional perspective, as well as doing them on your own from a researcher perspective? So we looked at this incurred by institutional offices, as well as the researchers to manage and share their data. So we found that average cost for institutional data management services was $750,000. There was a range across institutions. And that included a lot of different units together providing services. From the researcher perspective, we found that the average per funder research project cost for data management and sharing was close to $30,000. And so you can imagine the individual project cost per funded researcher at an institution with hundreds of annually funded projects would scale dramatically. And so we do have some projections of that in our report Shauna mentioned. And it's interesting to note that people reported covering this cost both directly from grant funds as well as using supplemental lab funds, departmental funding, and someone even was saying that they used their own money out of their own pocket to fund some of this work. And so when we looked at the spending individual researcher as a proportion of their total grant award, which is something we were interested in for future budgeting, we saw that on average, this was 6% of their total grant awards spent on data management and sharing. But if we looked at the smaller grants in our sample, we found that this was up to 15% on average of their grant awards. And for larger grants, this was a much smaller proportion that they were spending individually on their awards. So importantly, we wanted to see if there was any relationship between their reported behavior and how they were doing the activities or how they were sharing data and the costs associating with them. So one thing we did look at is the number of activities. So when we looked at the number of activities research engaged in either with institutional support or on their own and looked at their total cost they spent on data management and sharing, we saw that those costs are positively associated with the number of activities they reported completing on their own. And we didn't see a significant association between the number of activities done with institutional support, but you can see the scatter plot suggests perhaps there's a negative relationship there. Finally, we looked at the locations in which researchers were sharing their data associated that with their overall DMS costs. So researchers reported sharing in many different places, and they were able to select as many of these options as applicable in the survey. So we looked at expenses across each of those selected options individually. And so we found that researchers who used institutional repositories or IRs, which are repositories hosted by universities for researchers affiliated with that institution to share data, to share some or all of their data, had an average DMS expense of about $7,000. The average of those who did not use an IR, so all the other bars, was about $35,000. And so you can see on the graph that data sharing in IR was also associated with the lowest average DMS cost of any of the sharing methods. So I'll turn it back over to Shauna for some implications.
Right. So we know a few things. So we know that there are non-trivial data management and sharing expenses, both for individual researchers and for institutions. Our research indicates over $29,000 as the average cost for DMS or data management and sharing per project. However, we recognize this number could vary if we had included additional funders. We also recognize that data management and sharing costs have a greater impact on smaller awards, likely because these data management and sharing activities need to be done to some extent, regardless of project size. Our findings also indicate that making use of local support, such as engaging with institutional services for completing these DMS activities or sharing data in an institutional repository, was associated with lower costs for individual researchers. So this could be for a variety of reasons, of which we'll explore in the second phase of our project, which was funded by the IMLS and currently underway. So that kind of finishes us off for today. Thank you for joining us for a really quick review, and please contact us with any questions.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for your presentations. These were all fantastic. Please do share if you've got a preprint or anything like that up. We'd love to see that, or any kind of contact information for folks who want to talk more about this throughout the rest of the conference and afterwards. And thanks everyone for an amazing first day.